The early morning chill was still taking over the small room when Pedro opened his eyes. The tin roof creaked slightly in the icy wind blowing outside. He huddled under the thin blanket, trying to put off getting out of bed for a few more seconds. But he couldn't afford that luxury. He turned to look at his father, Antonio, who was sleeping in the bed next to him. His face was pale, his features marked by fatigue and illness. His breathing was slow and heavy, as if each sigh required a gigantic effort. Pedro felt a tightness in his chest. He never said out loud, but he was terrified that one day he would wake up and no longer hear that breathing. Carefully, he slid off the makeshift mattress where he slept on the floor. His feet touched the cold floor, and he shivered. He pulled his worn-out shirt over his thin body and picked up his worn-out sneakers from next to the door. He had to leave before the day broke. Before leaving, he did what he always did. He knelt down next to his father's bed and observed his face for a few seconds. He wanted to believe that everything would be okay, that the treatment would work, and that his father would be as strong as before. But reality weighed on his small shoulders. He was no longer just a boy. He was the person responsible for the house. He picked up the old canvas bag and left, closing the door carefully. Outside, the street was still deserted. The sky was beginning to lighten timidly, and the smell of bread baking in the air announced that the bakery on the corner was already open. His stomach growled, but he ignored it. He couldn't spend money on food now. The walk to the market was long, but Pedro was already used to it. The uneven sidewalks, the peeling facades of the houses, and the dogs running through the alleys were part of his routine. He quickened his pace, feeling the cold wind blow against his face. The sooner he got there, the better. As he turned the last corner, he saw the movement starting. Vendors were setting up their stalls, stacking fruits and vegetables in a hurry. The first customers were already walking around, choosing their produce while chatting loudly. Pedro was familiar with the hustle and bustle of the fair. He approached one of the stalls and helped Mr. Joaquim, one of the oldest vendors there. In exchange, he would get some fruit to sell on his own. With nimble hands, he began to organize the oranges he had brought. "I'll sell everything today, Dad," he muttered to himself, as if words could make it come true. At that moment, he didn't know it yet, but that day would change his life forever. Pedro settled behind his small, makeshift stall. The oranges glistened in the faint light of the rising sun, and he knew he needed to sell them quickly. Money was tight, and every coin counted. The market's activity increased as the minutes passed. Vendors shouted their offers, customers bargained, and the smell of fresh fruit mixed with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee coming from one of the stalls. Pedro liked that environment, despite his tiredness. It was there that he felt useful, where he could help his father in the only way he knew how. As he organized the fruit, a hurried metallic sound caught his attention. He raised his head, frowning. The noise came from far away, but was getting closer quickly. People's voices seemed to mix into a collective scream as the sound grew louder. Then he saw it. A car was careening down the narrow street of the fair, swerving sharply between the stalls and the people. It honked its horn nonstop, but it seemed like the driver had no control over the vehicle. Pedro froze for a second. His heart pounded in his chest. Everything happened too fast. That was when he noticed a little girl in the middle of the road, standing still, holding a package of bread that had probably fallen. Her eyes were wide with fear, her body stiff. The car was moving forward. Pedro didn't think twice. He dropped the fruit and ran. His body moved before his mind could process what he was doing. The voices around him seemed to fade away. All he could see was the girl and the car approaching. With a sudden impulse, he threw himself forward, grabbing the girl and pulling her away at the last second. The car skidded past, hitting a pile of boxes next to a stall. The impact was strong, and fine dust rose up. Silence took over the place. For a few moments, no one moved. The girl trembled in his arms, still in shock. Pedro felt her rapid breathing against his chest. "Are you okay?" he asked, breathless. It took her a moment to answer, but she finally nodded, her eyes still wide. It was then that a tall, well-dressed man ran through the crowd. His face was pale with despair, his eyes scanning the place until they found the little girl. "Clara!" His voice was choked. The girl let go of Pedro and ran into the man's arms, who held her tightly, as if he was afraid of losing her again. "My God, Clara, are you okay? Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Pedro stood there, not knowing what to do. People around him began to murmur, some pointing at him, others still looking at the wrecked car. The man finally looked up and stared at Pedro. You saved my daughter," he said, as if he was still trying to understand what had just happened. Pedro just nodded, feeling the weight of all the eyes on him. He hadn't done anything serious. He had just done what anyone would do, or at least that's what he thought. But that simple act would change his life forever. The silence at the fair was broken by a growing murmur. Everyone seemed surprised by what had happened. Some people approached to see if Clara was okay, while others still looked at the wrecked car. Pedro felt his heart slowed down little by little, but his legs were still shaking. He had never been through anything like this before. The tall, elegant man held his daughter in his arms, relief written all over his face. He looked at Clara as if he wanted to make sure she was really there, safe. Then, slowly, he turned his gaze to Pedro. "You saved my daughter," he repeated, his voice still choked. Pedro didn't know what to say. He just scratched the back of his neck awkwardly. "She was in the way of the car? I just did what needed to be done," he replied, looking at the ground. The man approached, still holding Clara, and extended his hand to Pedro. "My name is Eduardo. I don't even know how to thank you. You saved what's most precious to me." Pedro shook his hand quickly and shrugged. "I just did what anyone would do." Eduardo shook his head as if he couldn't believe it. Then he put Clara down on the ground, took his wallet from his pocket, and took out a wad of bills. "Please accept this. It's a small thank you for what you did." Pedro looked at the money and felt his face heat up. There were several bills, more money than he had ever seen in his life. Enough to buy food, pay the bills, and maybe even get better medicine for his father. But something inside him hesitated. He looked at Eduardo, then at Clara, who still looked shaken. The idea of taking that money didn't seem right. He hadn't done it for a reward. Pedro shook his head. "No need, sir." Eduardo frowned. "What do you mean?" "It's just a way of showing my gratitude." Pedro took a deep breath. "I don't want money." The silence grew heavy around them. Some people who were still watching the scene exchanged surprised glances. Who would refuse such an amount of money? Eduardo was speechless for a moment. Then he lowered the money a little, looking at Pedro as if trying to understand. "So, what do you want?" he asked curiously. Pedro felt a lump in his throat. The answer came easily, but at the same time it was difficult to say out loud. "My father. He's sick. If you really want to help me take care of him." Eduardo blinked a few times, as if those words had struck him unexpectedly. He looked at Clara, who was squeezing his hand, and then looked back at Pedro. At that moment, something changed in the businessman's gaze. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, something he might not even know how to explain. "Tell me more about your father," Eduardo said, putting the money back in his pocket. Pedro took a deep breath and began to tell. He didn't know that that simple request would change the course of his life forever. Pedro swallowed hard before speaking. The weight of that conversation was beginning to weigh on him. Eduardo, still holding his daughter's hand, watched him closely, as if trying to understand the boy in front of him. "My father's name is Antonio," Pedro began, trying to keep his voice steady. "He got sick some time ago, and since then he hasn't been able to work anymore. I do what I can to help, but..." He paused for a moment, looking away. The money is never enough. Eduardo remained silent for a few seconds. He looked at Pedro with a mixture of surprise and respect. So, instead of money for you, what you want is help for your father? He asked, as if he needed to confirm what he had heard. Pedro nodded. If you can help him get better, that is more than I could ask for. Eduardo sighed and ran his hand through his hair, clearly touched by the boy's answer. That took him by surprise. He had already met many people who would do anything for money, but here was a boy who would refuse a small fortune without thinking twice. You said your father is sick. Has he been to the hospital yet? Is he undergoing any treatment? Eduardo wanted to know. Pedro lowered his head. Not like he should. The medicines are expensive, and I can only buy some when I sell them at the market. But it is not enough. He is getting worse. Clara, who had been listening to the conversation in silence, he shook his father's hand and looked at him with shining eyes. Dad, we can help Pedro, right? Eduardo looked at his daughter and then at Pedro. Something inside him had already made a decision before he even realized it. I own a hospital in the city, Eduardo revealed, crossing his arms. And I'm not just going to help your father with the medicine. I'm going to make sure he gets the best treatment possible. Pedro blinked, not believing what he was hearing. What? Eduardo smiled slightly when he saw the boy's surprised expression. That's right. I'm going to arrange for a doctor to examine your father today. He'll have everything he needs, free of charge. Pedro felt the ground disappear for a moment. His heart raced, and he felt a lump in his throat. He had left home that morning just to sell some fruit, and now he was hearing that his father would get complete treatment? But what? Pedro asked, still not understanding. Eduardo bent down to be at his level. Because you showed me something I haven't seen in anyone for a long time, he answered seriously. Honesty, courage, love for your father. You saved my daughter without thinking of a reward, and now I want to do the same for you. Eduardo's words echoed in Pedro's mind, his chest filled with a mix of emotions that he couldn't name. Clara smiled and held his hand. You'll see that everything will get better now, Pedro. Pedro looked at her and then at Eduardo. For the first time in a long time, he felt something different inside him. Hope. Pedro was still trying to process everything he had just heard. His chest rose and fell quickly, as if he was short of breath. He never imagined that, in a single day, his life could take such a big turn. Are you serious? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. Eduardo nodded, his gaze firm and determined. Yes, Pedro. I've already arranged everything. Within an hour, the medical team will be at your house to evaluate your father. Now I just need you to take me to him. Pedro looked around, feeling his heart hammering in his chest. This wasn't a dream. It was real. His father would be treated. A real doctor would take care of him. He swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, of course. I'll take you right now. Clara smiled when she saw his excitement. Everything will be fine, Pedro. I promise. Wasting no time, he quickly gathered his fruit, threw it into the bag, and said goodbye to Mr. Joaquim, who was watching the scene from afar, surprised. Go, boy. Take care of your father, Joaquim said with a small smile. Pedro didn't need to hear anything else. He began to walk quickly through the streets, with Eduardo and Clara following close behind. Each step he took seemed lighter, as if the weight he had been carrying for years had diminished. Upon entering the small house, Pedro felt the same old sensation as always. The still air, the soft smell of medicine, and the silence broken only by Antonio's heavy breathing. The room was dark, the curtains closed to keep the light from bothering him. His father was lying down, as always, with his eyes half closed. Pedro approached the bed and gently touched his hand. Dad, it's me. I came with a friend. Antonio blinked a few times, his tired eyes focusing on Pedro before shifting to Eduardo, who was now standing in the doorway, watching the scene carefully. "Ooh, who is he, son?" Antonio asked, his voice hoarse and weak. Pedro exchanged a quick glance with Eduardo, who then took a step forward. "My name is Eduardo. Your story touched me, and I want to help," he said, his tone sincere. Antonio looked at Pedro for answers. The boy squeezed his hand tighter. "Dad, you're going to get real treatment. He owns a hospital, and he's going to make sure you get everything you need." Antonio's eyes shone with a mix of surprise and emotion. He squeezed his son's hand tightly. "But why?" His voice was shaky. Eduardo stepped closer. "Because your son is an incredible boy. He saved my daughter today. Now, I want to repay you by helping you." Emotion filled the room. Antonio closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, a tear ran down his face. "I always knew my son was special, but hearing that from a stranger," he paused, taking a deep breath. "It fills me with pride." Pedro felt a lump in his throat. He had never seen his father so emotional before. It was then that they heard a knock on the door. "It must be the medical team," said Eduardo. Pedro quickly got up to open it. On the other side, a group of nurses and a doctor were waiting. They were carrying equipment and medicine. At that moment, Pedro knew his life was about to change forever. Pedro opened the door and saw the nurses coming in with backpacks and medical equipment. The doctor, a middle-aged man with thin glasses and a kind look, greeted Eduardo and approached. From Antonio's bed, "Good afternoon, Mr. Antonio. My name is Dr. Marcos. We're going to take care of you, okay?" Antonio tried to answer, but his voice failed. He looked at Pedro and then at Eduardo, still in disbelief. Never, in all those years of struggle, had he imagined that one day a doctor would be there, in his home, to treat him without charging anything. Pedro held his father's hand, as if to assure him that this was real. "You're going to be fine, Dad. They're going to take care of you." The doctor began to examine him while the nurses organized the equipment. They took his blood pressure, checked his breathing, and applied 4 fluids. Pedro watched everything, feeling a mixture of hope and fear. Eduardo approached and put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "He's going to get better, Pedro, and you also need to think about your future." Pedro frowned. "What do you mean?" Eduardo crossed his arms and smiled. "I want to give you a chance. In addition to taking care of your father, I want you to go to a good school. You're smart, Pedro. You deserve a better future." Pedro froze. School? He had never thought of it as a real possibility. He studied when he could, but his priority was always selling at the fair to help his father. Clara, who had been watching the conversation, approached excitedly. "That would be amazing, Pedro. You could study with me." He looked at his friend and then at Eduardo. It all seemed like a dream. "But I don't have a uniform, a backpack, or any supplies." Eduardo laughed softly. "That's not a problem. I'll take care of everything." Pedro felt a tightness in his chest. The idea of studying seemed good, but at the same time scary. He had never been in an environment like that. What would it be like to live with people who had never been through what he had been through? I need to think," he said uncertainly. Eduardo nodded. "Okay, but don't think too much. Opportunities like that don't come along every day." The doctor finished the exam and turned to Eduardo. "Mr. Antonio's condition requires ongoing care, but with the right treatment, he can make a good recovery. We will arrange for the medicine and weekly hospital checkups." Pedro smiled for the first time in a long time. "Thank you, doctor." The doctor nodded. "Your father is lucky to have a son like you." Pedro squeezed his father's hand and felt that, for the first time, hope was not just a distant thought. It was there, in front of him, changing his life. But he still didn't know that the biggest challenge was yet to come. The following days passed like a whirlwind in Pedro's life. His father began treatment at the hospital, and the difference was already visible. Antonio seemed stronger. His breathing was less labored, and the fever that had previously consumed him constantly was no longer as frequent. Pedro, on the other hand, lived a mix of happiness and anxiety. Now, in addition to taking care of his father, he had to prepare for something completely new, studying at a real school. Eduardo kept his promise and provided everything: uniforms, materials, even a new backpack. However, something still bothered Pedro. He was grateful for everything, but he felt out of place. Would he be able to adapt to a world so different from his own? On the eve of his first day at his new school, while he was helping his father get into bed, he heard a knock on the door. He found it strange because it was already late. "I'll get it," he said, walking to the door and opening it. Outside, Eduardo was standing, but his expression was different from that time at the fair. He seemed tense. "Pedro, can I talk to you and your father for a moment?" Pedro frowned, but nodded and opened the door wider for him to enter. "Of course, Mr. Eduardo." Antonio, already lying down, raised his head a little when he saw Eduardo enter. "What happened? Is there a problem?" Eduardo hesitated for a moment before taking a deep breath. "I found out something you need to know. Something very important." Pedro looked at his father, then back at Eduardo. The air in the room seemed heavy. "What is it?" he asked, feeling his heart race. Eduardo ran his hand through his hair, visibly nervous. "I asked an investigator to look for some information about you and your family, Pedro. I want to know more about your story, and I discovered something that took me by surprise." Pedro held his breath. "What?" Eduardo looked directly at Antonio, his expression full of emotion. "Antonio, we are brothers." The silence that followed was overwhelming. Pedro blinked, not quite understanding what he had just heard. His father, on the other hand, remained completely still, as if he didn't know how to react. "What?" Antonio's voice came out weak, almost a whisper. Eduardo nodded, taking a step forward. "You and I were separated when we were children. I thought I would never see you again, but now, here we are." Pedro looked at his father, waiting for a reaction. Antonio ran his hand over his face, as if trying to organize his thoughts. I don't know what to say," he murmured, his eyes teary. Pedro, still shocked, looked from Eduardo to his father. "So, you're my uncle?" Eduardo smiled slightly, despite his emotion. "Yes, Pedro, I'm your uncle." Antonio, still visibly shaken, swallowed hard and looked at his brother. How did you find out?" Eduardo took a deep breath. The investigator found old documents, adoption records, dates that matched perfectly. "When I first saw you, I felt something familiar, but I didn't know what it was. Now I know." Pedro was still trying to process that. Everything in his life was changing too quickly. First his father receiving treatment, then school, and now a family he never knew he had. "This is unbelievable," he murmured, feeling his heart racing. Antonio looked at Eduardo, and, after a long moment of silence, his eyes filled with tears. I thought I would never see my family again." Eduardo approached and put a hand on his brother's shoulder. "But now we're together again, and I won't let you go through any more hardships alone." Pedro watched everything, feeling that his life had just taken an even more unexpected turn. He was no longer alone, and, deep down, something told him that there were still more truths to discover. The silence in the small room seemed to weigh more heavily than ever. Antonio blinked a few times, trying to absorb everything he had just heard. His brother, who he thought he had lost forever, was there, right in front of him. Pedro looked from one to the other, his heart beating fast. His mind was still trying to process that revelation. "Dad, why didn't you ever tell me about Uncle Eduardo?" he asked, his voice coming out lower than he would have liked. Antonio sighed deeply, closing his eyes for a moment before looking at Eduardo. I didn't know where he was. When we were children, we were separated. I went to an orphanage, he to another. Over time, the memories became more distant, until it seemed like he was just a childhood dream. Eduardo nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. I tried to remember too, but there was nothing that led me to you. Only now, after so much time, have I managed to find the pieces of this puzzle. Pedro watched the two of them with a heavy heart. His father and uncle, after so many years, were reuniting. He never imagined he had more family than his father. We have so much to talk about, Antonio said, finally smiling. Eduardo took a deep breath and, without thinking, took a step forward and hugged his brother. It was a strong hug, full of years of unspoken longing, of pain buried in the past. A hug of reunion. Pedro stood still, watching that intense moment. Even though he was still confused by everything, he felt something inside him warm up. Clara, who was watching everything from the door, smiled excitedly. "This is incredible. You finally found each other." Eduardo stepped back a little and looked at Antonio seriously. "I don't want to lose you anymore, brother. Now that we've found each other, I want us to be together. You and Pedro are coming with me." Pedro's eyes widened. "What?" Antonio seemed to hesitate. "Eduardo, I don't know if—" Eduardo interrupted, holding his brother's hand. "You don't have to carry this burden alone anymore. I have a big house, space for you. And Pedro can study without worries. You don't have to struggle alone anymore." Pedro looked at his father, not knowing what to say, moving to his uncle's house, leaving the small house where they had lived all their lives. It was a scary idea, but at the same time, maybe it was the chance for a new beginning. Antonio looked at Pedro and held his hand. "What do you think, son?" Pedro swallowed hard. He didn't know what to answer, but deep down, he felt that his life would never be the same after that day. And he didn't even know that this was just the first truth he was about to discover. Pedro felt his heart racing. The idea of moving to his uncle's house seemed surreal. He looked at his father, who was waiting for his answer with a look full of uncertainty. I don't know," Pedro said, lowering his gaze a little. "Our house may be simple, but it's the only place I know." Antonio sighed, running his hand over his face. "I understand, son. I never thought about leaving here either. But after everything that happened, maybe it's the best thing for us." Eduardo nodded. "I don't want to force anything, but I want you to know that you don't have to go through any more hardships. Now you have me." Pedro was still trying to process everything when he realized that something was still bothering him. Ever since he could remember, he had only had his father. He had never met his mother, and whenever he asked about her, Antonio would change the subject. But now that he found out he had an uncle, he needed more answers. "Dad, what about my mother?" The room went silent. Antonio, who was still holding his son's hand, stood still. His gaze, which had been emotional before, changed to a heaviness that Pedro had never seen before. Eduardo frowned, noticing his brother's discomfort. "Antonio, you never told him about Pedro's mother?" Antonio took a deep breath and lowered his head. I thought it was better this way." Pedro felt his chest tighten. "Better this way? Dad, I have the right to know." The man looked up, his eyes filled with tears. "I know, son. I know." Eduardo placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. "Antonio, I think it's time." Antonio nodded slowly, as if he was gathering the courage to speak. He looked at Pedro, his expression full of regret. Her name was Maria. Pedro felt a shiver run down his spine when he heard that name. "Maria," he repeated in a whisper. Antonio swallowed hard and continued. "She was the most incredible woman I've ever met. Strong, kind. You have a lot of her in you, Pedro." The boy held his breath. "So, why didn't you ever talk about her?" Antonio's eyes grew even heavier. "Because remembering her was always too painful. Pedro felt his heart tighten. He had never seen his father so vulnerable before. Eduardo looked at Pedro and then at Antonio. Antonio, where is she now? Pedro's father looked away and was silent for a moment. When he looked back at his son, tears were streaming down his face. I don't know. Pedro felt a lump in his throat. What do you mean you don't know? Antonio took a deep breath, as if reliving something he had tried to forget. She disappeared when you were still a baby. I looked for her, but I never found any answers. And over time, I accepted that she might never come back. Pedro felt his legs weaken. So she could be alive? Antonio nodded slowly. She could, but I never really knew what happened. Eduardo looked at Pedro and squeezed his shoulder. Maybe it's time to find out. Pedro, who until that moment had never imagined that his mother could be alive, felt a spark of hope grow inside him. He didn't know where this search would lead him, but now he was sure of one thing. He needed to find the truth about his mother. Pedro felt his heart racing. All his life, he had believed that his mother was dead, or that she had simply never wanted to be with him. But now, faced with this unexpected revelation, a new possibility arose. What if she was alive? What if there was a chance of finding her? He looked at his father, who seemed worn out by the conversation. Antonio took a deep breath, as if he were reliving something he had tried to bury in the past. Dad, you've never heard anything about her? No clue. Antonio hesitated for a moment before speaking. After she left, I tried to look for her, but I had no resources. I only knew that she had family in a city called Santa Cruz, but I didn't know where exactly. Pedro felt a mixture of anxiety and fear. Santa Cruz. That was a starting point. Eduardo, who had been watching everything in silence, crossed his arms and looked at Pedro seriously. If she has family there, we can start with that place. I have contacts who can help us look for information. Pedro swallowed hard. Would you really do that? Eduardo nodded. Of course. You deserve answers, Pedro. And if your mother is alive, she also deserves to know that you are looking for her. Clara, who was watching everything with bright eyes, approached and held Pedro's hand. I think you have to go after this. You don't want to spend the rest of your life wondering what happened, do you? Pedro was silent for a few seconds. No, he didn't want to live without knowing. This doubt had been with him for too long. He looked at Eduardo. How can we start? Eduardo picked up the phone and dialed number. Pedro didn't know who he was talking to, but he could see that it was something serious. After a few minutes, Eduardo hung up and looked at him. I got some information. Santa Cruz is not a big city. If your mother had any family there, there's a good chance we can find someone who knew her. Pedro felt his chest tighten. This was really happening. When can we go? Eduardo smiled slightly. Pack your things. We'll go tomorrow. Pedro exchanged a quick glance with his father. Antonio seemed apprehensive, but deep in his eyes there was something different, maybe a little relief. I just want you to know that no matter what happens, I've always been here for you, son, Antonio said, his voice thick with emotion. Pedro nodded and hugged his father tightly. I know, Dad, but now I need to know the truth. That night, Pedro could barely sleep. His heart was full of anxiety, anticipation, and fear. The next day, he, Eduardo, and Clara left for Santa Cruz. Pedro didn't know what he would find there, but one thing was certain: his life would never be the same again.